Order Senate Concurrent Resolution 4008, which has been read. Mr. Chief Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, in gross Senate Concurrent Resolution 4008 was introduced by Senator Dwyer. In gross Senate Concurrent Resolution 4008 is a concurrent resolution to amend and reenact Section 1 of Article 15 of the Constitution of North Dakota relating to term limits for members of the Legislative Assembly, to repeal Section 4 of Article 15 of the Constitution of North Dakota relating to prohibiting the Legislative Assembly from proposing certain amendments to Article 15 of the Constitution of North Dakota and to provide for an application. Mr. Speaker, your Government and Veterans Affairs Committee Representative Shower Chairman recommends do not pass on a gross Senate Concurrent Resolution 4008 by a vote of 8 yeas, 5 nays, and 1 absent or excused and not voting. Mr. Speaker.
Representative Van Winkle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker and members of the Assembly, Senate Concurrent Resolution 4008 comes to you from your Government and Veterans Affairs Committee with a do not pass recommendation. Consistent with the very same intention bill about 2 weeks ago that came out of our committee with the same recommendation, and which we killed on this floor 72 to 20 something. So again, what this seeks to do is change the term limits that the Citizens Initiative had passed and has put in our Constitution that we are prohibited from changing. But yet we're going to attempt round 3 of changing it from the inside out. So this wants to repeal Section 4 of Article 15 of our Constitution. So we'll go to Article 15 of the Constitution and read what it says in Section 4. Notwithstanding, which I had to look up that word just to be clear that it really means what I thought it means, and it means regardless of. So regardless of the Legislative Assembly's authority to propose amendments to this Constitution under Article 4, Section 16 of the Legislative Assembly shall not have authority to propose an amendment to this Constitution to alter or repeal the term limits established in Section 1 of this article. The authority to propose an amendment to this Constitution to alter or repeal the term limits established in Section 1 of this article is reserved to initiative petition of the people under Article 3 of this Constitution. So right here we are basically going to try to tell the people that the work that they have done, their citizen right to petition their government, is we're not okay with that. And so from the inside out, we're going to break this constitutional prohibition that you placed on us, and we're going to demand it anyway if we pass this bill. I want to remind us why it wouldn't have made sense for them to repeal Article 4, Section 16, because that is the article that gives us the power to propose amendments to the Constitution in the entire document, except for the one that says we cannot change the term of a legislator's time in service. So nothing is prohibited from our abilities to do our job, and so we have full authority to change the Constitution in any other measure, except for that one that the people said no. So then people question, well, do the people really have the power to do this to us? And I would say our Constitution says yes. Article 1, Section 2, all political power is inherent in the people, and they have a right to alter or reform the same whenever the public good may require it. Now, during this entire effort, I have actually never seen any of these public come in here and say that they made a drastic mistake and they did not know what they were doing and they don't intend to term limit us. All I've ever heard is dissatisfaction from us as legislators saying only we know how long we should be here and we want it overturned. And that really is not the topic that we should be discussing, whether we agree 8 years is enough or 10 is better or 16 is the best. What really is appropriate here is how we're trying to do what we are doing, and it's been prohibited, but are we going to do it anyway is the big question of the day. And I would hope we would be consistent with what we did last time, and we would say, no, we're going to uphold our oath of office and uphold what our citizens' rights are. Article 3, Section 1, power is reserved to the people, states that while the legislative power of the state shall be vested in the legislative assembly, the people reserve the power to propose and enact laws by the initiative, to approve or reject legislative acts or parts thereof by the referendum to propose and adopt constitutional amendments by the initiative. This article is self-executing and all of its provisions are mandatory. So I don't know how we're going to justify overrunning the will of the people. Article 1, Section 20 has a provision in here that says to guard against transgressions of the high powers. And again, that word transgressions is pretty a pretty deep word. And basically it's like saying to guard against the abuses, the sins, of the high powers which we have delegated. We declare that everything in this article is accepted out of the general powers of government and shall forever remain inviolate, which means we are not to violate these things. And it has been passed that we are prohibited from doing this, and it is reserved to the powers of the people in the initiative process. Section 24 says the provisions of this Constitution are mandatory and prohibitory unless by express words they are declared to be otherwise. So they are mandatory that we follow them, and they're prohibitory should they prohibit us from something by express words. So again, I will remind you, the express words were that the power reserved to changing term limits is reserved to the initiative process. Now, this is what the people had to do, and they had to go get their signatures and spend all their time taking effort to do that, to which they passed this limit on us by 63%. So I don't think that there was any mistake. I've never seen them show up to the hearings to say that they made a mistake. It's literally only been ourselves. So with all that said, I would hope that we would uphold the constitutional rights of our citizens to address their government and uphold our oath of office and be consistent with what we're doing here, because as we heard last week or 2 weeks ago, we were going to let the dust settle. So the question was that dust going to settle for 2 weeks? And we had a plan all along to pass this bill or remain consistent and uphold the will of the people. I would urge you to vote red as your committee recommendation of a do not pass. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is there any discussion? The House has Representative Satram.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly. I don't think this is a slam dunk. I think there's a question of whether or not this is or was the will of the people. There was questions about many of the signatures. There was questions about the way it was advertised and promoted. Term limit Congress. We're not Congress. If it was Congress, I probably would have signed that one. We're a citizen legislature. We're here 80 days, every 2 years. Anybody that thinks about it would realize that this is a different situation. Several people to me said, I didn't know. I thought it was about Congress. We shouldn't be afraid to put this before the people. This is not, there were questions, honest questions. Let's settle this for good. Please vote yes.
Representative Hedlund.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the bill carrier yield to a question, please?
Representative Van Winkle, will you yield to a question?
Yes, I will.
Representative Hedlund.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, the Constitution gives authority to the legislature. Let's just use taxation, for example. With the logic that you're using to defend what was put into the language on the term limits initiative, do you think that it would be constitutional and the legislature could not question a measure that had the signatures gathered for and said something to the effect that we the people are done with taxation and the legislature cannot challenge us on this? And it passed. If that happened, would the legislature be able to do their constitutionally given duty of taxation in no matter what form we're talking about, or the conflicting language in the new measure that just passed that says we the people are taking away the authority of taxation from the legislature and you can't ask for it back. Only we can. What's going to rule? I think that's what we're trying to get at, or at least that's what I am trying to get at here. I don't know that I believe that the Constitution has taken our authority away to challenge this, because it gives us that authority to put initiatives on the ballot. I think there's a question here. I did not hear in any of your speech in carrying this bill that questions our ability to put anything else on the ballot. I think you agreed, and I think you mentioned that we could. So I think there's some real question here. I don't think that there's an issue with us putting this on the ballot. I don't think there's a constitutional issue at all. And I would encourage this body to pass this bill.
Mr. Speaker, I will attempt to answer that. So Article 6 of the federal Constitution basically is a supremacy clause that any federal responsibilities that we have take precedent over our state laws. So if we have the power to legislate taxes, no, they couldn't completely abolish that. However, the people did try to put a restriction on a constitutional measure to stop us from charging them taxes, and that was defeated. I'm trying to think of more of how to answer his question. So he was asking, I think, if they can limit the power, but the reality is the people put one restriction on us, and it was the amount of time that a legislator can serve in this position, which does not restrict us one iota from doing our job or, let's say, cleaning up issues or problems within our Constitution. I think there's a really deep interest here to overrun the will of the people, to say, you are not going to have any power to do this to us, and unless we agree with it, we are going to overturn it, and probably continue to overturn it, because if we pass this bill today, the most recent bill that you pass becomes the most recent law in place. So the years that have already accrued that would have counted down towards the 8 years is now going to be overrun by 16 years. So the clock is going to reset. We'll go for another 16 years. Who knows? Maybe at year 14, we'll propose that, we want 20 more years on top of that. So effectively, there is no power to the people to restrict their government if we pass this bill. And I think that's an extreme violation to our citizens, to our Constitution, to our ability to say that there are checks and balances, and to say that our citizens actually have the ultimate authority here. We're going to say today that no, you don't. Only this legislative body does, and we will prove that here today by our vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Casper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly. It's interesting. I've been waiting to hear what Resolution 4008 does, and I haven't heard an explanation of that. I've heard a diatribe on what the Constitution does or doesn't do, what the people can or cannot do, but I still don't know from the presentations what 4008 does. The dilemma that is being discussed from my perspective is the powers of the legislature, which have been referred to in Article 4, Section 16, which reads, any amendment to this Constitution may be proposed in either house of the Legislative Assembly, and if agreed to upon a roll call by a majority of the members elected to each house, must be submitted to the electors, and if a majority of the votes cast thereon are in the affirmative, the amendment is a part of this Constitution. That was in our original Constitution and is there today. Article 15, which says we cannot abide by Article 4, Section 16, did not repeal Article 4, Section 16. That's still in our Constitution. So we have a constitutional difference. Article 15 says one thing, Article 4 says another thing. The issue here on 4008 is, are we as a legislative body going to place it in front of the voters for them to decide? That's the issue. It really isn't the constitutional matter that some people want to argue. It's, do we want the people to vote and decide if they want to make a different choice than what they did when they passed Article 15? So I believe that that is the constitutional matter, and it may go before the North Dakota Supreme Court if we do pass 4008, which I think is probably the place it should go. But I would hope that we would pass 4008, let the people decide. They decided on Article 15, and I've talked to numerous people as I travel around our state, talking about this term limits that we face, and say, you know, as the previous speaker said, I thought I was term limiting Congress. There were booths that were set up to gather signatures to put Article 15 on the ballot, had signs, Congress, on them. That was misinformation, and that was one of the reasons that our previous Secretary of State threw those signatures out. So I think it's time to get this on the ballot, move it forward, let the people decide.
Representative Vetter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly. I think we're getting in the weeds here a little bit about can we have the power or don't we have the power? Really what you should be voting yes or no on, is this a good measure to bring before the people? We have a lot of important measures that we've already passed through this body that we'd like the people to consider. One of them being the 60% measure. One of them being the single subject measure. Those are important issues that we'd like to get before the people. Let's not confuse the issue by bringing them another term. If we're going to bring a term limits measure, let's bring one that actually does something. This measure really doesn't do anything. It literally allows somebody that is, has a partial term to have a full term. Other than that, it keeps the time frame exactly the same. If you look at the original version of this bill, I could support something like that. But this measure, all it does is it keeps everybody in one house. The senators don't want to become representatives. That's really what this bill is, because that's all it does. I'm going to vote no because it's a bad measure, not because we can or we can't introduce this resolution. So I would ask for a red vote. Thank you.
Representative Shower.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly. As we know, there has not been much of an appetite in this session to place a term limits bill on the ballot. However, the GVA minority position on 4008 believes this bill may be useful in terms of having the North Dakota Supreme Court step in and decide if it is constitutional or unconstitutional to limit legislative authority, as was mentioned in Article 15, Section 4. As was discussed in our hearing and now this afternoon, would it be fair if the Constitution limited an initiated measure on a certain issue, saying it could not be altered or repealed? Section 16 of Article 4 allows the legislature to submit amendments to the Constitution. Supporters of 4008 say the current term limits law needs North Dakota Supreme Court clarity. Opponents of 4008 say the people have spoken and any change needs to come from an initiated measure, not by the legislature placing it on the ballot. As you can see, it was a close vote in the GVA. I suspect it'll be a close vote today, Mr. Speaker. We put it in your hands.
The House has before it, for final consideration, Senate Concurrent Resolution 4008. The clerk will open the key and you may record your vote. Has every member voted? Do any members wish to change their vote? The key will be closed and the clerk will take the record. Final vote shows 46 yay, 43 nay. SCR 4008 is declared failed. The House will be on the 17th order of business. Representative Hedlund.
Mr. Speaker, engrossed Senate concurrent resolution 4008 was introduced by Senator Dwyer. Engrossed Senate concurrent resolution 4008 is a concurrent resolution to amend and reenact section 1 of Article 15 of the Constitution of North Dakota relating to term limits for members of the Legislative Assembly, to repeal section 4 of Article 15 of the Constitution of North Dakota relating to prohibiting Legislative Assembly from proposing certain amendments to Article 15 of the Constitution of North Dakota and to provide for an application. Mr. Speaker.
Representative Van Winkle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly, 4008 was heard yesterday. And again, what it does is it repeals section 4 of Article 15, which was the prohibition on the Legislative Assembly offering the opportunity to change the term limits, which is also what they want to change out of section 1 of that same article to be from what it currently is to become 4 complete 4-year terms. So that would not affect somebody who has been appointed into filling a position like a few here in this assembly right now. And I may have misspoke yesterday thinking it would start after the bill was signed, but apparently it does go back to individuals elected after January 1, 2023. So I don't know if that actually means people who were just elected and are in this session. So I don't know. Anyway, it's adding more years onto what the people had passed for 8 years, and it's revoking the prohibition on taking this route. And so we're taking it anyway, is how I understand it. So y'all know where I stand, and I was a red vote and was hoping that we would uphold what the Constitution says and take this by the way of the initiative measure. Vote red. Thank you.
Is there any discussion? Representative Brandenburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, member of the Assembly, as you think about this and what happened in the past with the term limits and how they came about, and as I visit with the people back home, they go, you know, we thought we were voting for congressional seats. When we were voting on this, it didn't have anything to do with congressional seats. All it had to do is the legislature and the governor's office. And as you think about all the things that we do, looking at the budget stabilization fund, ending fund balance, legacy fund, streaming bill, the institutional knowledge that we have in the different committees, and you think about when you get to the point where the term limits do end and you lose all of that knowledge, you lose all that experience that people have. And so if we're going to have term limits, then let's do it right. Let's have term limits when we have a smooth transition, and so that the people have the proper representation to be able to make sure that the people's voice are heard. When we look at, we're the closest thing to the people's voice. We're the ones that the people vote for. And so if we're gone without some transition period that is smooth and has a knowledge to be able to pass on to the next legislators that take our place, we need to be able to have that time frame to be able to do that and do it smoothly and do it for the good of the people that we represent. And so, Mr. Speaker, I would ask that we pass Senate Concurrent Resolution 4008. Thank you.
Representative Lauser.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I'm about to say is not for the benefit of this chamber, because my assumption or our assumption should be that we understand this. But when we look at something on the board that says SCR, the CR is continuing or constitutional resolution. It's not a bill, and it's been referred to a bill numerous times. This body can't change the Constitution. And the confusion that I'm seeing back home is people think this body's trying to change the Constitution. We are asking ourselves to put this resolution on the ballot for the people of North Dakota to decide how they want to vote. And that's democracy. So I see the confusion in the words that we're using and why the public might be confused. We're just charging ourselves with putting this on the ballot to let the people of North Dakota vote. And then I think it's pretty clear by the language what they'd be voting on. I would encourage a yes vote.
Representative Hoverson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Assembly. Yeah, I hope this is a no vote as well. I guess what was on the ballot before was in plain print. And I don't know who these people are that thought it was congressional versus state, but I have a really hard time believing there were that many that couldn't read or didn't read the ballot that would have changed their vote. This was a 63% of our North Dakota citizens that voted for this. So yeah, maybe there were a few people at your cafe, coffee club, or maybe at your kitchen table, but I think we're going to have a really hard time selling this to the people that, you know, what would that be? 15 to 20% of you must not have read this correctly or must have been fooled somehow. Not only that, it was well publicized. It was one of the most talked about measures that year. So I'm having a really hard time buying the idea that, sure, there may have been some that were confused, but to say that there were so many that would have overturned a 63% vote is really hard. So I just hope we send a better message to the people, I guess. And I think a no vote would say, we respect your vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The people did vote for Article 15, and they did vote by 63%. That's a huge margin. We act like we've been, I don't know, boxed in somehow, but every legislator here could go and do an initiated measure and have this changed without going against what we have in the Constitution. So I haven't seen anybody go and do that to try and repeal Section 4 to get rid of that piece of Constitution that we don't like. To one of the previous speakers, I keep hearing about institutional knowledge, and I realize that there's a lot of really good information that people like me, new people here, could use. But that institutional knowledge has also tripled the budget in the last 10 years. So there's kind of a trade-off, I think. I ask that you vote right on this.
Representative Vetter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly. I'd ask for a red vote on this. This is not the time to do this. We have important measures on the ballot right now. I mean, it's a matter of, do you think those are important as I think they are? I think they are very important to have the 60% measure to change the Constitution and the single subject to change the Constitution. These are important measures we need to get for the people. And we can't have all kinds of measures just coming at them and several different messages. We need to get this right. We need those measures to pass. Who's gonna fund this measure? Because we do realize now that this doesn't go to a conference committee. This doesn't go anywhere. We vote yes on this today. This goes on the ballot. Who's gonna fund this measure? Is somebody here with a pocketbook gonna fund this measure to somehow change all those percentage of voters that voted against this? Do you really honestly think that the people that voted 60-some% for this measure that they're going to now all of a sudden turn around and go, yeah, I'd like to give you guys an extra 8 years to stick around. It just doesn't make any sense. So we're going to put something on the measure that we know is likely not going to pass. Nobody's going to fund it, but yet, and all it's going to do is end up jeopardizing the other different measures we have on the ballot. Yesterday, we had a discussion on can we do this as the legislature? And a lot of the discussion was based on can we or can we not do it? I believe we can, but I don't think that's going to be ultimately decided by a judge. A judge somebody's going to run for term limits again. Ultimately, it needs to be decided by a judge. If we go ahead and put this on the ballot to say, okay, can we or can't we change this measure in a small little print, but all the people are going to see is we're changing the term limits. So they vote this down. All the arguments I hear out of this chamber are going to be mute because the people have spoken then. The people looked at that question and they said, can we propose? Can we not propose? I believe a judge would allow us to propose, but if the people looking at this measure vote no, that's giving them all the more ammo now to say, what are you guys doing proposing a measure on term limits? If we're going to introduce a measure on term limits, let's introduce a measure that actually does something. This doesn't even change the amount of time we're in. The biggest problem we have with term limits is the institutional knowledge. This doesn't change. We're still going to have four full terms versus 8 and 8. How much does that change? Is this really that big of a change that we want to bring to the people? I don't think it is. If we're going to bring a measure, let's bring a measure that actually means something. Look at the original measure of this, the original version of this measure. That was a good measure. It was 3 and 3. That's a good measure. If we're going to take a chance on something, let's take a chance on something that's good. Then we also hear about arguments, are you for term limits or aren't you for? I'm not for term limits. I don't think it's a good idea. I agree with all the people about the institutional knowledge, but this is not the measure that's going to fix it. So I would ask that we think about, other than just this current vote, what's going to ultimately happen by passing this measure. It's going to be another measure on there. All people are going to be talking about term limits. And if we're going to make that discussion and push for term limits, let's push it with a real measure. And this just doesn't do it. I'd really like to have a no vote. Obviously from the reconsiderization vote, it doesn't look like it's going to happen, but really sad that this is what we're going to do. Of all the different measures we're going to have, this is what we're going to put up. A measure that really does nothing. Just allows the senators to stay in the Senate and I guess the House to stay in the House. That's all it does. And the people are going to say no anyway, because what gives them what's the incentive for them to say yes? Are we here long? This whole institutional argument that we make that we need institutional, this doesn't fix it. Doesn't fix anything. In fact, it says, yes, you were right. You were right on 8 years and 8 years. We're telling them, yep, you're right. I don't think they're right. I think what was right was having a few more terms other than 2 terms. 2 terms is just not enough. So anyways, I'd like a red vote. Thank you.
Representative Fraley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members of the Assembly, I just wanted to draw your attention to the testimony. I think it was brought out last time, but there is absolutely no testimony in favor from a citizen of North Dakota on here. So if all those people who voted were mistaken and felt duped by thinking we were voting for Congress, they did not show up and testify for this bill. And I just wanted to draw your attention to that. I hope you'll vote red.
Representative Pyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly, there's a few things that I think need to be corrected with the truth. The bill carrier was incorrect. It does not change the number of terms. It does not double it. This just changed a structural change. So you can do 2 terms in this House and 2 years in the Senate. Changes it to 4 terms, 4 terms total. So it's the same amount of terms, but you can just do it in the same chamber if you so choose. Number 2, as far as doubling and tripling the budget, take a look. Since 2010, we've had an oil boom, we've had floods, and we've had COVID. We know what's coming up in Minot. They're getting the Sentinel programs in a few years. They're having 3,000 workers, and that entire community is going to need state funding. So if you don't want us to pay for anything, we can hold the money back. We have other great $6 billion that go out to all of our political subs. We are looking at funding all of the taxes right now, right? So that's going to be money going out. That's money coming from us. So when we look at the bottom line and the state spending money, that's the money we're spending. So let's be realistic for what we're talking about. As far as growing the state budget, it's going out to the people, spending for infrastructure, spending on the needs of the state. Number 2, this is my 5th session. You need a little bit of political capital and knowledge to dig into these budgets. We spend hours and hours and hours digging into these. And each session, I learn more and more about the base budget and the programs that we do and what we fund and the people that do the projects. I know it sounds very self-serving, but honest to goodness, like if we're here as public servants and for the little amount of money that we get, this really isn't. It's about service to our state and our community. It's not about the title or anything. It's about giving back to the great state and wanting to do better for the next generation. Because I know that's what we all campaign on. But let's be truthful when we bring things to the floor and speak about the good work that we do. The actual budgets, it's hardly increased as far as the general fund budget dollars, but when the oil is up and we got to balance the budget, the money has to go out to pay for the infrastructure where it is needed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Satram.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly. Yesterday, we heard a lot about the will of the people. And today we have talked about how complicated it is. And I think really the people in North Dakota are smart enough to process 3 measures on the ballot. I think they can handle it. But this is the point I wanted to bring out. In 2010, the people of North Dakota established a legacy fund. Last election, we put a measure to reduce the percentage that the legislature could access. I don't remember an outcry when we proposed that. It isn't about the will of the people, it's about whether the people have the ability to change their minds. The public has proven that they're open to reopening discussion when new information becomes available. This resolution would settle the issue. Nothing to be afraid of. Please vote green.
Representative Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and my honored colleagues in the Assembly. You know, when you officiate a hockey game, whether it's the little squirts or it's the bantam, one thing we don't do is do a marble theory. You know, I gave out 4 penalties over here. I have to give 4 penalties there. What does that have to do with anything? Well, a previous speaker noted that we should look at the testimony. So I did. Let's see, one fellow was U.S. term limits. Another is the attorney for U.S. term limits. Another was a member of the